Picture yourself in the Halcyon Reach during the long dark of the Saltjo years. You are aboard an ore hauler. Your cargo holds heavy with refined metal, your engines straining across a debris belt so old it predates 3 of our calendars. You are not a soldier. You are a freighter pilot, perhaps the 4th generation of your family to fly this lane, and you have never in your life completed a crossing without paying. The toll is not collected by any government. It is collected by hooks and grapples and the long shadow of a raider that drifts out from behind a dead moon with its running lights doused. You hand over a third of your cargo, and you are grateful, because the families who refused are no longer flying anything at all. I'm a Veil archivist, and my people measure time in a way yours would find unbearable. We watch glaciers of stone drift across the void and call it weather. We have cataloged the rise and ruin of 40 civilizations, and I tell you plainly that nothing in those 40 records prepared me for what one small, unarmed human vessel did to the most untouchable criminal empire the Reach had ever known. For 3 generations, the Saltjaw Pact owned that sea of shipping lanes the way a tide owns a coast. And then in the span of a single year, the pact was simply gone. No final battle was ever recorded. No fleet broke their lines. The warlord who had bled the Reach white was not slain in glorious combat. So how does a reign that survived 3 navies and 100,000 graves end without a single decisive shot being fired? That is the question I have spent 2 of your centuries trying to answer. Let me show you what I found. To understand how impossible the ending was, you must first understand how total the reign had become. The Saltjaw Pact was not a gang. It was an economy. At its height, it commanded over 200 raider craft, dozens of hidden anchorages carved into hollow asteroids, and an informal tax authority more reliable than any legitimate one in the sector. The Reach was the perfect hunting ground precisely because it was perfect for trade, narrow lanes threaded between dead worlds, fuel depots spaced just so, mining platforms too far apart to defend one another. Every chokepoint that made commerce efficient also made commerce vulnerable, and the Pact had mapped every single one. They did not need to win battles. They needed only to be present, and presence was free. 3 separate navies tried to end them by force, and each attempt taught the galaxy the same brutal lesson. You cannot blockade 1,000 routes with 100 ships. You cannot besiege an enemy who has no city, only the dark between cities. The Avrit conquered sent a battle group of 40 warships and lost 11 to ambush before the rest withdrew, having accomplished nothing but the creation of 40,000 new orphans and a fresh crop of recruits desperate enough to join the only employer still hearing. The pact actually grew stronger each time it was attacked, because every burned freighter and every grieving family produced another body willing to crew a raider. The rain was not a fortress to be stormed. It was a fire that fed on the very water thrown at it, and the galaxy, after the 3rd failure, quietly decided the Halcyon Reach was simply lost. So when the humans announced they were sending a single ship, the assembled diplomats of 4 species laughed. I have the transcript. The laughter is noted in the record. The vessel that arrived was named the Meridian, and if you had been standing in the receiving bay of Halcyon Station the day she docked, you would have laughed too. She was small, a survey-class hull, the kind used for mapping asteroid density and cataloging trade flow. She carried 2 light point defense turrets, the sort you would mount to deflect debris, and absolutely nothing that could threaten a raider. What she carried instead was antennae. Sensor masts and data spines bristled from her like the spines of a deep-sea creature, so many that the dockmaster's first report described her as more listening post than ship. Her captain was a human named Mara Velasco, and her first official act upon arrival was not a speech, not a threat, not a show of strength. Her first act was to request, in writing, the complete docking and cargo records of Halcyon Station for the preceding 11 years. The dockmaster, an Avrit of considerable cynicism, refused. Velasco filed a formal request through 3 jurisdictions, had it stamped by a magistrate 2 systems away, and returned 4 days later with the authority to compel the records. She read them, all of them, My people have a deep reverence for the patient accumulation of knowledge, and even I found this baffling. Here was a woman sent to end an empire of murderers, and she spent her first week of war reading shipping manifests and filling out forms. The station crew began to mock her openly. There is a phrase that survives from that period, scrawled on the wall of the human birth by some unknown hand. The clerk has come to save us. It was meant as an insult. I find it the truest thing anyone wrote that entire year. Now watch what the clerk was actually doing, because this is where the genius begins, and it is a genius so quiet you could miss it entirely. While the Reach waited for the human warship to do something warlike, Captain Velasco was studying piracy the way an accountant studies a failing business. She did not ask where the raiders were. She asked where the money went. A stolen hold of refined ore is worthless until someone buys it. A raider craft is helpless until someone sells it fuel. A warlord commands nothing without someone willing to feed, arm, and harbor his crews. The pact had 200 ships, yes, but those ships drank from a supply system, and a supply system, unlike a raider in the dark, cannot hide. It has addresses, it has account ledgers, it has receipts. For 2 months the Meridian never chased a single pirate. She drifted at the edges of the lanes with her forest of antennae drinking in every transponder ping, every fuel transfer, every encrypted purchase order in the Reach. Velasco's logistics officer, a meticulous woman named Devika Rao, built what the crew came to call the map, not a map of where the pirates struck, but a map of where the pirates lived. Which depot sold them deuterium and asked no questions? Which respectable mining concern bought their stolen ore at a discount and shipped it onward with forged provenance? Which station official took a quiet cut to lose certain customs records? The map grew until it covered an entire wall of the Meridian's hold, a glittering web of arrows all pointing not at the raiders, but at the legitimate, comfortable, untouchable institutions that made the raiders possible. The pact thought of itself as a predator. Velasco had found the thing it actually was, a parasite with a host, and a host has veins, and veins can be closed. So she began to close them, and she began without firing a shot. Understand that everything the humans did next was, on its surface, almost unbearably boring. There was no boarding action, no daring raid. There were affidavits. There were sealed regulatory filings. The Meridian transmitted to every legitimate buyer in the Reach fully documented proof that the ore they had been purchasing was stolen, complete with the original manifests, the murdered crews, the falsified provenance. Buying it was now a crime any magistrate could prosecute, and Velasco had thoughtfully attached the prosecutions. Overnight, the discount ore the pact relied on became radioactive. No respectable concern would touch it. The fences who had quietly grown rich found their accounts frozen and their reputations attached to mass graves. One by one, the buyers closed their doors. Then came the fuel. The depots that had sold deuterium to raiders without asking were politely informed in writing that the practice was now thoroughly documented and that their operating licenses depended on a sudden attack of curiosity about their customers. The Meridian did not threaten them. She simply made honesty cheaper than corruption and watched the depots discover their consciences. Within weeks, a raider that had once refueled anywhere now had to cross half the Reach to find a single crooked tank, burning the very fuel it sought to reach it. The pack's plunder began to rot in its own holds, cargo it could not sell, sitting in anchorages it could barely fuel. The Avrit navies had thrown 40 ships at this empire and made it stronger. Velasco threw paperwork at it, and for the first time in 3 generations, the rain began, very quietly, to starve. They had spent decades attacking the symptom. She had found the disease. But starvation alone does not end an empire. A cornered, hungry warlord is the most dangerous kind, and a packed bled of profit might simply have turned to raw butchery, taking what it could no longer buy. Velasco understood this better than anyone, and so the third part of her campaign was the part that I, as a chronicler of cold histories, find almost impossible to write without something my species does not officially possess, which is the sensation you would call awe. She did not only close the doors, she opened one. To every low-ranking member of the Pact, every desperate refueler, every conscripted gunner, every orphan of the Navy's failures who had joined the raiders simply to eat, the Meridian broadcast an offer. Lay down your arms and you will not be hunted. You will be given passage, a wage, honest work, and after a term of service, full citizenship under human protection. The offer was not a trick. It was notarized. It came with forms. The Reach had never seen anything like it. The navies had offered the pirates only death. The Pact had offered them only more piracy. Here, for the first time, was a third door, and it had a name on the threshold. The first to walk through it was a young raider, barely past adolescence by human reckoning, named Tomas Aldana, a freighter family's son who had lost everyone in an Avrit crossfire and joined the Pact at 14 because the alternative was vacuum. He came aboard the Meridian expecting interrogation. Instead, Captain Velasco sat him at a table, slid a document across it, and walked him through it line by line. His name, his statement, his grant of amnesty, his birth assignment, his first week's wage paid in advance. He told the debriefers years later that what broke him was not kindness. He had been braced against cruelty, not kindness. It was the stamp. The heavy, bureaucratic, official thud of an ink stamp landing on a paper that said, in the dullest language imaginable, that he was now a person with a future. He wept, he said, not because he was saved, but because he was filed. Behind him came a trickle, and behind the trickle came a flood. And here, at last, the great misdirection of the entire campaign comes apart in your hands, and you see what was hidden in plain sight from the very first day. The galaxy had sent a warship to fight a war, but the Meridian was never a warship, and Velasco never fought a war. Look again at that bristling forest of antennae and understand that it was the artillery. Look at the map on the hold wall and understand that it was the fleet. Look at the stamp landing on Tomas Aldana's amnesty papers and understand that that sound, that dull, clerical, almost comical thud, was the only weapon ever discharged in the entire campaign, and it was fired 10,000 times. The crew of the Meridian used to joke in the early days that their captain would try to file a war crime against a black hole. They had mocked the clerk who came to save them. They did not yet understand that she had brought the only thing that had ever actually worked. You do not kill a parasite by stabbing it. You cure the host, and you offer the parasite a chance to become something other than a parasite. Velasco had simply refused to believe that the pirates were the problem. The problem was the system that made piracy the only sane choice. So she built a better choice, and she documented it in triplicate. Now let us cross, for a moment, to the heart of the Pact, and stand where no navy ever managed to stand, in the throne hold of the Salt Joe himself. Picture the warlord on his seat of welded scrap, a being whose name had emptied harbors and silenced markets, surrounded by trophies stripped from ships across 3 generations of dominion. For 30 years he had risen each cycle to reports of plunder and tribute. Now he rises to a different kind of report, and it does not compute. His ships are not being destroyed. His anchorages are not being stormed. There is no enemy fleet on his scopes, no battle to rally his crews against, no glorious last stand to summon. There is only a number that goes down each cycle and then down again. His crews are not dying. They are leaving. They are flying to a small gray ship full of antennae and filling out forms, and they are not coming back. The Saltjaw did what every cornered tyrant does. He searched the dark for someone to fight. He sent his best raiders to find the Meridian and end her, and his best raiders found a small, unarmed survey vessel that surrendered her position willingly, transmitted her amnesty offer on open channels, and watched half the boarding party defect on the spot. He raged at the depots that would no longer sell to him, and the depots showed him the documentation and shrugged. He executed the messengers who brought him the desertion counts, and the executions only accelerated the desertions. You can almost pity him, this creature who had mastered every form of war the galaxy knew, standing in his throne of scrap and discovering that the one weapon he could not counter was a woman who refused to fight him. There was no wall for him to throw his fleet against. There was only a slow, patient, unbearable subtraction, and the dawning horror that he had already lost a war he had never been allowed to wage. The collapse, when it came, was not an explosion. It was an erosion, and it was almost gentle, which is perhaps the most terrible thing about it. A pirate empire is held together by the promise of plunder, and once the plunder rotted in the holds and the amnesty door stood open, there was simply nothing left to hold it together. Crews that had served for years did the arithmetic death and hunger on one side, a wage and a stamp on the other, and the arithmetic was not difficult. Anchorages emptied. Lieutenants who had murdered for the pact discovered they could murder for nothing, and one by one they queued at the meridian with their statements ready. The Saltjaw's 200 ships dwindled to 50, to 20, to a handful of true believers who finally understood that there was no longer anything to believe in. The reign that 3 navies could not break broke itself, because Velasco had removed the only thing that had ever sustained it, which was despair. The warlord himself was the last reveal, and it is a small one which is fitting. When the human authorities finally took him into custody, peacefully, at a depot, where he had gone to beg for fuel that no one would sell him, they discovered that the Saltjaw had a name from before he was the Saltjaw. He had been a fuel hauler once named Resh, run off his own lane by raiders in a younger generation of the same reign he would later command, left with nothing and no door to walk through but the dark one. The monster who had terrorized the Reach for 30 years was simply the Reach's oldest victim, made in exactly the same forge that Velasco had finally chosen to put out. The Meridian never fired her turrets. Not once. The most feared empire in the sector ended in a fuel queue, with a tired old hauler signing the very kind of form he had once been denied. The clerk had come to save them, and she had. I have spent 2 of your centuries with this record, and I will tell you why a Vale archivist, whose people forget more history than yours will ever make, returns to it again and again. We are a species that worships permanence. We build to outlast suns, and in all our long cataloging of conquest, we had come to believe what every navy in the Reach believed, that the way to end a predator is to become a larger predator, that order is imposed by the strongest jaw. The humans taught us we were wrong, and they taught it not with a fleet but with a filing cabinet. Even now, with all the power our 2 peoples have since gathered, predators are still ended this clean way far too rarely, because it requires a patience that pride cannot afford and a mercy that fear cannot allow. It is so much easier to send the 40 ships. It is so much harder to read the manifests, close the veins, and open the door. But here is the lesson the Meridian carved into our archives, and it is the one I would have you carry away into your own dark and crowded age. You do not end a predator by killing it, because the conditions that made it will simply make another. You end it by removing the thing it feeds on. And the most permanent victory ever recorded in the Halcyon Reach was not the one that left the most enemies dead. It was the one that left the enemy alive and stamped and grateful. A fleet of murderers turned into a generation of citizens, a warlord turned back into a hauler, an entire sea of fear quietly converted into trade. Mara Velasco never won a battle because she understood something the rest of us took 40 civilizations to learn. The strongest jaw does not end the hunting. Only the open door does that. So the next time you are told that a thing can only be solved by force, remember the clerk who came to save them and the 10,000 stamps that ended a reign, and ask yourself what door no one has yet thought to open. Keep reading the manifests. Keep questioning the dark, and I will see you in the next record.